We
Doing
are
it.
live. It is Wednesday, June 17th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. It's raining in Washington. Our days of glorious weather are over. John Bolton's book is out.
Sort of.
We are not allowed to have fun sort of, not, but it's leaking all over the place because he's John Bolton and that's how he rolls. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Susan Hennessey, who I have to say is about as good a proxy for fun as I know.
Right up to the edge without actually becoming fun.
That's what we aim for.
Mm-hmm.
That's our sweet spot.
if you actually substituted for fun, you wouldn't be allowed on the show.
Naturally.
Kate, the monologue is yours today.
Yeah. So yesterday I walked out to the mailbox that I installed many months ago at this house because there was no mailbox because no one ever lived here. And I opened it. And inside was a package, and I had ordered some stuff from Amazon that had gotten lost in the vortex of West Yarmouth, as was discussed yesterday. But this was not from Amazon. It was just a package, and it had a T-shirt in it with no note that said, I can't tell if this is purposefully printed, crooked. It is not that I'm wearing it wrong. I think that, or someone did a really shitty job with the screen grab, but is it backwards for you guys or can you see it?
No, we see it just fine.
Oh, okay. So it says otherwise objectionable, and then it has a citation to the U.S. code that is section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which anyone who watches the show knows I care a lot about and talk a lot about.
Who is it from?
I have no idea.
Maybe Senator Hawley sent it to you.
You're the third person to suggest that.
Can I just say that, Kate, I know a lot of odd people, but I only know one person who would get an anonymous Section 230 shirt.
Really? Because I know at least 15 people that might have sent this to me.
But they didn't get one.
Yes, that's true.
You received today an anonymous package, not with a brick of heroin or
marijuana
butter or anthrax powder. None of that. You received an anonymous delivery of the nerdiest shirt ever.
And it's badly made. I just want to point that out.
It reminds me of the time somebody sent a chocolate pentagon to Lawfare and Ben wouldn't let us eat it because it was of unknown origin.
Yeah.
I guess you counseled others.
He lied. He wanted it for himself.
I did eat the chocolate pentagon, but that was the last time. You were the one who was like, I am not touching the chocolate pentagon.
True. That's true.
The chocolate pentagon we eventually traced to a Costco where they sell chocolate pentagons. But we never found out who sent it to us.
So in any event, I'm going to go back to my monologue, which is that otherwise objectionable. And the reason that this is more perfect on top of perfect on top of more perfect is that otherwise objectionable is a phrase in section 230 that has now been proposed by Senator Hawley to cut today. This entire section that basically gives protection to all of these platforms to monitor content and to moderate it. But the funniest thing is that otherwise objectionable is basically true of all coverage by reporters of section 230. I spent 5 hours on the phone with different journalists today, in part because I just deeply care about getting it right and the narrative of it being right out there about what people are talking about. I had 2 call me back because they were so turned around on everything. And I just kind of want to say that I think going forward that this is just not that confusing an issue. You cannot sue. I'm going to give my 5-second version of Section 230. Section 230 says that websites that have content up that is posted by other people are not liable for being, like, you cannot sue them for defamation or some other like communications torts because of Section 230. They just like take them and they chunk them into this little thing and you can't sue them. Other types of sites like NewYorkTimes.com, Lawfare, places that would be considered publishers or kind of news organizations have traditionally been subject to liability for that type of thing. So this is just about creating a separate category for these organizations. That's all that's like 99% of what Section 230 is. And it has just become such a weird cudgel and political tool of the right and the left whenever they want to do anything. And the thing that I find the most striking is that they don't have to ever get the law right or get any parts of their understanding of it right in order to serve their purposes. And so for Senator Hawley, what I mean about this, and for Trump with his like executive order the other week, this just means that basically they can come out with these things. They make no legal sense. They are not like administrable. They're not going to fly in court. They're just kind of nonsense, not consistent with anything, because they don't matter. They're just political theater. They're just like using parts of the law to make points and to score points with their constituency. And I'm kind of just like, I could not be less interested in that type of puffery and kind of shenanigans. And it's one of the reasons I kind of hated living in DC. I just like don't like, and being around Washington a lot was just like, man, I just couldn't. I just thought that it was the worst, most intellectually vacuous way of like going about any of these problems. And so that is all. If you sent me this t-shirt, thank you. I don't have many clothes. I left New York without clothes. I have to do laundry frequently because of this, but I recently just like wore out like 2 pairs of jeans. So if you want to make some Section 230 shirts or Section 230 pants with like on the butt, like Section 230, I will totally sit on those and you can send them to me whenever you want to.
We will send you Lawfare shirts.
Oh, please. But again, I don't need shirts. Pants. I mean, I guess I do need shirts. I need some pants.
We don't make Lawfare pants.
I haven't really even put on a pair of jeans for 3.5 months. I just have been wearing sweatpants, pajama pants, or these overalls. That's
Susan
it.
Hennessey, what have you been wearing every day?
Yeah, what have you been wearing, Susan?
I've also been doing a lot of sweatpants, a lot of like pajamas on until 11, and a lot of like respectable up top, jammies on the bottom sort of a situation.
Do you think we're achieving
such as this?
Do you think we're achieving a point in society in which being dressed means respectable up top?
For the pandemic purposes, that's just factually what it means. Like,
I mean,
parts
but
that are
like,
visual to others.
It used to be that only talking heads on TV, which you and I both sidelight as, did that, right? There was a unspoken culture that, people might be wearing anything at all waist down, as long as they were very put together up top. But now that seems to have been like exported from the culture of, television, broadcast news, and cable to general sort of Zoom culture.
We're all just talking heads now.
I was on a call yesterday with someone at a tech company, and she was like, we'd had an hour-long conversation. It was just like this. And at the end of it, she was like, by the way, I'm 9 months pregnant and I'm about to go on maternity leave. And I had no freaking clue. And there was another guy in the call. I'm like, Stephen, are you pregnant? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, welcome to being male.
Yeah, I know. I was like, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea that you were pregnant. Like, that was like actually crazy. Let alone 9 months pregnant. So yeah, it was, I was thinking about how many, she was like, it's funny how we let our bodies do the talking for us on that. Like how we're just kind of, and you've been pregnant, Susan, like I assume.
Once
you have children,
after a television appearance, when I was 8 months pregnant, someone on Twitter tweeted at me that it was, quote, so obvious that I was pregnant. Which
so
I guess get you a medical degree. Yeah. As if I was like attempting to hide the like watermelon I was smuggling.
Watermelon smuggling is one of my favorite terms for excellent adoption.
All right, Susan, let's talk John Bolton. Because we've got like 150 people watching this, and they're here for your John Bolton analysis. So here's my question.
That's why I'm here.
Let's spend the first 5 minutes talking about how we evaluate John Bolton, and then move on to the substance of Bolton's claims, which we're just getting a glimpse of now. But is there anything to say in defense of John Bolton?
No, he has comported himself terribly, even by John Bolton's standards.
Ooh.
And like, let's just sort of reset the clock here, right? So after actively campaigning for this position as National Security Advisor, John Bolton becomes Trump's National Security Advisor. The whole time he's trying to sort of wheel and deal and has this vision of himself as like the real power behind the throne. Trump catches on to this in relatively short order, being sort of keenly aware of anyone else who's trying to circumvent him at all times. John Bolton appears to get sidelined. He is part of a great many very, very problematic encounters. He's almost certainly the source of a great many contemporaneous leaks about these various encounters. He's also a key player in this episode in which the President of the United States attempted to withhold congressionally appropriated military aid to a foreign partner in order to extort that foreign partner into undertaking a pretextual investigation of his political opponents. When Congress said, seems not great, maybe we should impeach him, John Bolton was requested to come and voluntarily testify. He refused to do so. He then sort of played these games in which he decided to fight a subpoena from the House, but when it went to the Senate, he decided he said he would comply with a subpoena from the Senate. So there's been some speculation that like, maybe he just wanted to give the appearance that he was fighting. Maybe he wanted to respect the Senate and not the House because the House was controlled by Democrats. So maybe he really did want to testify. If he did, he played his cards wrong because, surprise, Senate Republicans decide, you know what, they don't really need to hear what John Bolton has to say, even though John Bolton is saying, I have relevant information. So they vote not to call John Bolton as a witness. That's on the Senate Republicans, and we can talk about the implications of that. At that point, John Bolton still has a choice to make. We already know that he is writing this book. He's shopping this book around. Reportedly, he gets a $2 million advance for it. And he's in a little bit of a pickle at this point because the White House has the ability to prevent, at least in part, the publication of this manuscript using this process called pre-publication review. Now, if John Bolton had just testified and just done sort of, I don't even want to call it a patriotic duty, I mean, bare minimum here of complying with legal process and telling what, as a government official, telling your employers, the American people and the United States Congress, information they are entitled to know, John Bolton sat on it. And now, with great fanfare, he has decided to reveal all for the bargain price of $32.50. And the strange part is that throughout this, Bolton has advanced different sort of theories as to why he would not want to comply, including citing this notion of executive privilege, wanting to respect the process, running to respect the pre-publication review process. But when push came to shove and it was time for John Bolton to make money, he apparently had no more concerns about executive privilege, and was willing to violate the rules of the pre-publication review process. So John Bolton is bad, top to bottom. He's a bad actor in this, and history should really, really judge him as harshly as possible. But just because John Bolton is a really, really bad actor, doesn't mean that it's appropriate or tolerable for the President of the United States to exercise his constitutional authorities, namely the control of and authority over classified information, in order to prevent individuals from engaging in what is First Amendment protected speech that happens to criticize him. And I don't think that there's anybody who believes that the government actually believes that there is information that's legitimately classified or legitimately poses a threat to national security. And so while it's a little bit of a like, let them fight and who cares who wins and who loses, it is a moment in which I think our sort of sense of schadenfreude for John Bolton needs to give way to some larger principles here and say that what the White House is doing here is just fundamentally unacceptable. And that's even before we get to all the stuff Bolton is now revealing that's new information about what Trump has done.
Right. So let's clear the deck of everything except the new stuff, what he is revealing. Some of the information that he's talking about here involves the conversations between the president and foreign leaders. My assumption is that such private conversations are presumptively classified material. On the other hand, the president, the Justice Department has conceded in its filing that the career official who reviewed the matter came to an understanding with Bolton that on the basis that all the classified material had been removed. When you say you don't think anybody believes that there's legitimately classified material in there, why isn't a conversation between the president and Xi Jinping presumptively classified?
Because one of the standards in the classification executive orders, and remember, this is all done by executive order sort of flowing from the president's constitutional prerogatives, is that there are specified reasons why material can be classified, and preventing embarrassment is not one of those reasons. So while you say you think it should be presumptively classified, and I think that's probably right? So you can sort of presume everything around it's classified. It doesn't mean every single part of it is classified unless that's actually, somebody's actually undertaken that action. And so the idea that this conversation would pose a grave threat to national security if revealed, or any articulable threat to national security, it just, that logically doesn't hold. And so what we're seeing here is not legitimate classified information. We're seeing information that's being held or being classified purely for the purpose of not embarrassing the president and shielding the president from the domestic political consequences of his statements. And so the idea that the president has the discretion and authority to make anything classified, and that discretion is largely unreviewable, so it might be formally classified, it doesn't mean that we have to recognize that as a legitimate use of the authority. And here it's not a legitimate use of the authority.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the key admission in the Justice Department brief is that they go through this process, they identify, they come to an understanding And then political people get involved and say, no, we want to look at more. And I think that's the point at which it becomes pretty hard to defend the idea that that there is legitimately classified material in here.
Can I ask a question really quickly? How long was he National Security Advisor?
Longer than Michael Flynn.
Yeah. That's what
450 days or so.
Okay, but like, yeah, and like
more than a year
in the revolving door of the White House. But what I was I had a top secret security clearance for a case that I was working on in the EDNY at a certain point, and had to go through all of that. And then, as like I'm sure you have, Susan, I know Ben probably has, and like all of the craziness. And I have to say that having then gotten to the other side of a lot of that classified material, it is just, in my opinion, not that classified. Like there is just a ton of it that is just like not that classified and not that. And I'm not saying it's not classified, because I understand that there are agents in the field that like need to be protected and everything else, but like I'm not talking about that. Like I'm talking about things that are redacted, that are coming from the coming from the source in question, that don't contextually don't have anything to do with like various types of like with anyone else. Like that couldn't possibly implicate anything other than like that particular person. And it just seems, I don't really understand how classification works at a very fundamental level. It feels like the worst kind of proactive law enforcement that I've ever seen. None of it, it's like, we're going to take, it's kind of almost like if our courts, instead of giving us rights and then having us like fight for them back, when we thought they were abridged, gave us no rights and made us fight for our rights in the first place. And that's what classification feels like to me from an information level. Does that make sense?
It does. And I agree with about 80% of what you said, and I think disagree with the fundamental premise. So there is a huge overclassification problem in the federal government. And a lot of it is not driven by some desire to hide information that should be public from the public to prevent oversight or transparency or anything like that. It's because of how the incentives within classification authorities work. So if you overclassify something, or you classify something at a higher level, or you classify something that shouldn't be classified at all, and then later somebody says, hey, that didn't need to be classified, it's fine. Nobody pays any price for that. If you are someone who doesn't classify something and inadvertently reveals something that it turns out to later be substantially detrimental to national security, you got a real problem on your hands. And so it's not just that the marginal cases become classified or that the classification level becomes ever higher. It's that it's sort of this ever expanding world. It's been something that the intelligence community has tried to get its arms around for a while. It's a real hindrance to congressional oversight. And we should acknowledge that the intelligence community has also used it to evade legitimate oversight and not have to answer for stories in the press, right? There's a lot sort of going on here. That said, information is presumptively unclassified unless the government takes the affirmative steps to actually classify it. And so this idea that like John Bolton writes a book and then after the fact they get to read it and decide, well, that really should be classified, that's an inverse of how the process works. The original reviewer was looking through it, trying to find, okay, here's this information, where has it been classified? And classification isn't like an inherent feature of some particular type of communication. It's a specific decision made by specifically designated government officials. And so that's where I think it's sort of, the flip, the sort of the everything's being turned on its head. That said, classified information is really important. And there's a lot of information that really legitimately needs to be classified. I think there is a tendency to, for people to underestimate the fragility and consequences of intelligence and of intelligence disclosure. And I think that there's an overestimation of any one individual's sense to determine what is validly classified information. So you might have seen things in that case and thought, what the hell difference would it make if the public knew this? How could it possibly matter? But for, except for this one person. But you don't know if the method of collection is somehow specific. You don't know the other pieces of the puzzle. And so that's why we want to have a process that is fair and reasonable and legitimate, because we need people who handle classified information to agree to participate in the process and not substitute their own judgment. Because once you get in a world where it's a lot of people within the government just substituting their judgment, then you're like in really, really dangerous territory. And that's why bad faith use of classification authority by the government, I think we should perceive as really, really dangerous to national security. Because if members of the national security community perceive classification as illegitimate, that's going to incentivize people to not comply with the process anymore, right? We see how overclassification or government dishonesty can drive leaks, in some cases really damaging leaks. And so, I think people should really think about like the systemic and structural consequences that this kind of behavior by the White House can have.
Well, the classification structures have to be in keeping with norms about what the classification level should be. And if they detour too far from social norms about that, like they're going to hit walls and hit leaks. And like people are going to think that they're whistleblowers. Okay, I have to go get something, and Ben is going to take over.
Yeah, so Andrew McMahon has a question. Andrew, please unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. So very, very quick one. So I'm not saying that this is what Mr. Bolton was trying to do. I think he was definitely, he has his self-interested reasons here. He wants to sell books. But it seems to me that if he had testified during impeachment, it would have just been batted away like every other bit of testimony, and it wouldn't have led to any real results as far as I can see, whatever he was going to say. But now that we are outside of the impeachment, one consequence of him waiting is that now it might get more airplay and more focus than it would have otherwise. Does that make sense to everybody, or would you? Because that's just how it seems that everything related to Trump works. Just one more fly to bat away.
So it's a great question, and I let's re-roll the tape and assume that everything that is in this book, however much there is, actually comes out in January. How is the world different, Susan?
So I think I disagree pretty roundly with that premise, because sure, if the idea here is that releasing it now generates more media attention or impact or outrage, I guess there's an argument for releasing it now. Although even that, I think if we actually go back and think about the issues we were focused on during impeachment, the ways in which these additional revelations, and I haven't yet read the full book, so I don't have every piece of it, but at least what we've seen in sort of the excerpts and reporting about it, how that would have refuted elements of the president's defense and buttressed other elements of it. I think one, it would have gotten more media attention. But setting aside the question of media attention, that was the moment in which Congress could have taken actual action on it. And one thing we've seen both Congress and this administration capitalize on is this idea of implausible deniability. And basically, even when stories come out that everybody knows are true, no rational person really believes that John Bolton made this up, right? Because it both complies and is consistent with the public record that we've seen about what President Trump has done, and because it'd be a really weird thing for John Bolton to make up, right? There aren't sort of incentives there. An individual being willing to say something under oath before Congress when there are actual legal consequences that is one, an additional sort of show, a demonstration of credibility. And two, is a moment in which the United States Congress is empowered to act and has all of the information. So their votes are saying either this is acceptable or this is unacceptable. And one thing we saw at the end of impeachment with the acquittal in the Senate was this sense of sort of Republican senators acting as though like it would have been bad, but it was never really proven, right? We never really saw Trump fully connecting this military aid to the actual investigations into Joe Biden or into Burisma or into Hunter Biden. And if John Bolton was in a position to put something on the record to make that connection, you know, I don't want to be sort of Pollyanna and say, well, you know, Congress is acting in total good faith. Yes, likely Republicans would have shifted once again, but it would have required them to shift ahead of their votes and allowed a mechanism to sort of be held accountable congressionally as well. And so I just can't think of any legitimate rationale for John Bolton, one, having not testified, and two, having remained silent for the past 5 months as he knew all of this information and there was nothing to prevent him from going public.
Kate?
I mean, I'm like, you went on this monologue yesterday about how you were going to read the book or whatever, and there were like a lot of people who
I think that monologue is highly vindicated by today's events, by the way.
Why? Why do you think that?
Because the book apparently contains the allegation that the president, at least on 2 occasions, affirmatively endorsed the idea of Uyghur concentration camps, because the book apparently contains the contention that the president asked Xi Jinping to intervene in the 2020 election. And because, as one major newspaper put it, Mr. Bolton does not say, this is a quote, that these are necessarily impeachable offenses, and adds that he does not know everything that happened with regard to all these episodes, but he reported them to Mr. Barr and Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel. They should have been investigated by the House, he said, and at the very least suggested abuse of a president's duty to put the nation's interest above his own. And I do think that raises important questions about the conduct of Pat Cipollone and Bill Barr. And so I think it is inherently important when when the former national security advisor of to the president is making such allegations about the president of the United States. And I agree with everything Susan said about how we should evaluate John Bolton. And I agree with, I don't think you have to embrace John Bolton as a convert to the cause to say those allegations are objectively important and they need to be discussed. They need to be ventilated in a serious way. And by the way, Joe Biden needs to have the advantage of knowing about those allegations so that the Lincoln Project can make ads about them. You know, and there is something important about knowing this about the president. And so I think we should all, I'm not saying people should buy John Bolton's book, but people should understand what he's saying about the man who is president. What do you think, Susan?
I agree with that. I think we had a struggle. We had a disagreement even whenever the book was first signed and John Bolton was refusing to testify. I actually sort of condemn everybody who was involved in this book. I think it was a really unpatriotic exercise from the very beginning. And I confess, I don't feel bad that a lot of those people are going to lose money now. That said, I'm still really alarmed by the use of these processes. However, if the end result of this is John Bolton wrote the book, the public is aware of the information, and all of the proceeds go to the US Treasury, as a matter of karma, I'm comfortable with that. That's and I totally agree, and I've always agreed that the substantive allegations are really important. It's more of John Bolton deciding to profiteer off his sort of, public service, and whether or not that should be rewarded. So I don't know. Check it out from the library.
Okay, so this is the one thing that I wanted to disambiguate, that I don't think that you properly disambiguated in your monologue yesterday, which is why I kind of give you I wanted to ask now why you doubled down on it, because I think that the monologue talks a lot about what John Bolton is saying. Listen, what John Bolton is saying, the information that is in this book is going to come out. Whether he had done this in a series of, what made him write a book and made him say all of this was that he basically had a huge economic incentive. He got paid a lot of money. And when you're some people say don't buy the book or don't read the book, was there's a huge difference between don't buy the book and don't read the book and don't know everything that's going to have been leaked by the book, because the information that he ultimately gives out in the book is going to end up being free, right? And everyone's going to know about it. It's going to be reported out. And you can't run away from that. That's just that is actually just kind of the nature of these things. But you don't have to spend your $30 and buy the book. And that's actually where I'm not clear what your problem is, how you're disambiguating those two things.
So yeah, I don't really take a position about whether people should buy the book or not. And just to be clear, I'm not going to buy the book. My problem was that on Twitter, a lot of people were saying, basically, his moment has passed. It doesn't matter what he says now. He missed his chance. And some people were saying that, who were very high profile members of Congress, were saying he had his chance to talk and he didn't do it. And I actually agree with that. But I think the implication is that it therefore doesn't matter what's in the book. And I think it matters very much what's in the book. And not because for the evaluation of John Bolton, but because Donald Trump's name is on the ballot in 5 months, 4 months, 5 months. And there are a lot of people who it actually matters. I mean, it's not a large percentage of the electorate, but in absolute terms, it's a fairly large number of people who may be less likely to vote for him under certain circumstances than under certain other circumstances. And I think it is objectively important when somebody of the stature in that world, and people should not underestimate the stature that John Bolton has in the conservative world. He has been, for the last 15 years, a kind of mainstay of Republican Fox News commenting foreign policy hawkishness. And for him to say this person is, let me give you chapter and verse on how unfit this person is a very significant moment. Now, does it mean we should embrace John Bolton as a reformed man and somebody who is not everything that we know him to be? No, of course not. But should we take seriously, as Susan just did, the substance of the things he said? Because why would he make that up? Yeah, I think we need to hold space in our hearts for the idea that people who are not good actors. By the way, this is exactly the same attitude I had toward Michael Cohen, right? He's a bad actor. He's a criminal. And he's telling things about Donald Trump that are important for people to hear. And I think it is important for us to be able to hold two ideas in our mind at the same time, that like Michael Cohen is a criminal who should go to prison. And he's, he is saying things about the president that he is uniquely positioned to say, and we need to be open to the substance of the information that he's conveying.
Susan, do you agree with that?
Do, right? So I think it's hard for sort of the Fox News media ecosystem to pivot quite so quickly to this is John Bolton just out to get the president, or this is right the liberals coming after Trump who's winning so much. I do think Bolton has the ability to sort of pierce a particular information ecosystem. I don't know that it's electorally significant, and honestly, I'm far less interested, and I think this is part of my why I think it's so egregious that he didn't testify during impeachment proceedings. This isn't just about Donald Trump. This is about the United States presidency and our understanding of acceptable, tolerable conduct and fundamentally intolerable conduct. And whenever we find out things and shrug, the institution itself changes, and in this case becomes warped. And my concern is that, yes, John Bolton, given the opportunity, might be able to change a few Fox News viewers' minds about the president being this sort of real threat. The problem is that the way that this has all come out, we're going to have a conversation about pre-publication review rather than why it is not just morally wrong for the president of the United States to tell Xi Jinping that it's okay to put Muslims in concentration camps. It's not just that that's an evil, morally abhorrent thing for a human being and something that deserves the strongest condemnation. It is contrary to the national security interests and positions of the United States. It harms us. And so I think that connection of Bolton being able to say, this isn't just a gross man doing gross things. This is a man who is using the elected office to harm the United States of America for his own personal financial and political benefits. That is the kind of thing that to the extent that John Bolton can move the ball forward even one iota on having the conversation on those terms, I think it's just it still is a real service to play.
Yeah, I think that's really a smart and like a very understandable way. We have a question from Kevin Donahue, frequent viewer, frequent participant. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Hi, Susan. So a while back, you put something on Twitter. It was something like people who are partisan in their normal lives, like senators, are less partisan when they're dealing with the intelligence community. And the exception to that is Mitch McConnell. He's just as partisan dealing with the intelligence community. I'm wondering if you could expand on that. It really stuck in my brain. And, is there significance to that aside from the example with like the Russia oversight that he stepped in on? Why does that matter? And just how can you speak to that?
So I don't remember the precise tweet, but I will say what I think the point I was probably trying to make if I was talking about Mitch McConnell in particular. So look, I'm at the risk of being presented with literally thousands of counterexamples because this is a tradition that's sort of honored in the breach. For somebody who works, so my prior role at the National Security Agency was not just as an attorney, but an attorney in the Legislative Affairs Office. So I spent a lot of time sort of communicating with members of Congress and their staff on the SSCI and HIPC. And you really get a sense from doing that work of the politicking that occurs out in public, right? So that, you know, Richard Burr or Dianne Feinstein might go out and, you know, make their political point. So it's not that like there's no partisanship, but that whenever you get behind closed doors, there is sort of a baseline pre-political commitment. And there's two things that happened or used to happen. One was that Congress understood in private behind closed doors that they were playing on the same team and the executive branch was on a different team, right? So at least for particular issues, they could align themselves as a legislative body instead of an executive body. And two, there was a certain sense of pre-political commitment, right? Everybody knew that everybody else in the room wanted to prevent terrorist attacks, wanted to keep people safe, maybe disagreed on sort of the right place to put the balance of transparency and oversight, but nobody really believed, you know, that Ron Wyden, you know, wants Americans to die, you know, by letting terrorists go. Nobody really believes that Richard Burr, like, you know, lights the Constitution on fire and doesn't care, right? It was this sense of sort of, okay, we all have really different, you know, political views and policy views, but there's a good faith commitment here to really wanting to find the right answer and keep people safe. That's not true at all anymore. The dysfunction that's occurred really beginning with the HIPC, just a complete and total fracture of any sense of bipartisanship. And I think now it has bled into the SSCI to some degree as well. That's a total thing of the past. But the significance about Mitch McConnell is that Barack Obama towards the end of the 2016 election, when he was aware of Russian efforts to intervene in the US election, went to Mitch McConnell, and Avril Haines and others, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, have talked a lot about this moment and this decision. And they presented the intelligence to Mitch McConnell because they understood that the only way that they could tell the public about this, about what was happening, about the Russian influence operations, was if they had bipartisan buy-in, because otherwise it was going to look as though they were just trying to hurt Donald Trump. And that's something they were really afraid of, undermining electoral legitimacy. So they knew that if they could get Mitch McConnell on board and they could both say, look, this isn't about Clinton or Trump, this is just about a foreign adversary. And in that moment, Mitch McConnell refused. He said that he was going to make clear that this was a partisan ploy. And so that's a moment in which I would suggest that almost any other American senator, or at least I could name 20 senators, Republican senators, who would have made a different choice in that moment. The idea that Mitch McConnell could not elevate the clear interests of the nation, even then, over sort of his constantly playing this partisan game, I think was just, it speaks to his character or lack thereof, and was a real wound to the nation. I don't absolve the Obama administration for sort of fumbling it from there. I don't think that their response to it was right, and I think there were tons of missed opportunities, but without remembering specifically what I was tweeting about, whenever I think back about Mitch McConnell and sort of national security decisions, you know, that actually is a single transformative moment that might have completely altered not just maybe the election outcomes, but actually our understanding of what happened in 2016, our ability to mount a bipartisan, strong response to what happened to prevent it in the future. And so I think like historians will come back to that moment as sort of being one of the critical failure points that got us to frankly the kind of catastrophe that we're in now.
Okay, Kate, I think we have time for a few more questions. I've got the Big Blue blogger and Matthew Chekhov up, but before we get to them, we have a question from the Lisa Page puppet, I believe.
We do have a question from the Lisa Page puppet. Hi, Kate. I have a question for the In Lieu of Fun podcast. Okay. So what do we do? And I actually think this is a brilliant question. This is Kate talking. This is a really great question because it hits on exactly everything I was trying to kind of like talk about when I asked you my question, Susan, but it's better stated by the Lisa Page puppet, who says, so what do we do with all these other witnesses to these conversations? Pompeo, Mattis, Kelly, other than recognizing them as horrible people, what obligation do they have to actually do something? about these statements in real time. Many of these actions are contrary to our national security. Does the notion that the nation's foreign policy is whatever the president says it is? And this is kind of exactly my point, which is that what is national security and what is important to national security just going to depend on the individual people that are there? And if you're at the very highest level, like, why is Bolton like a bad person for not doing more, blowing the whistle? There's just been tons of people like that in every administration, not even just this one.
Yeah, so I think this is a good question, right? And sort of the response to kind of the Russia investigation and the impeachment proceedings and all kinds of things from many commentators on the right is this is the criminalization of policy differences. And the president has the constitutional prerogative to decide what is in the national interest. And so somebody like me can't say that's contrary to the national interest, because only the president of the United States gets to say what's in the national interest. And in some basic constitutional level, that's actually true. Like, the executive branch is one dude and a bunch of people who work for him. And Donald Trump does get to decide what is the foreign policy of the country, what are particular national security positions of the country. But in the founders' infinite wisdom, they didn't say that the president, what they envision as holding the president accountable is, one, the legislature, and two, the public. And so this system doesn't work when the president is doing one thing, pursuing one foreign policy interest behind closed doors, and saying another thing in public. And right, that is a wound and a tear to the system. And the role of Congress is to help square the circle, right? To say, well, we're seeing one thing happening within the administration. We're seeing the administration making other statements. We need more information, right? Because the public needs to be informed in order to exert this political pressure. So if Donald Trump came out and said, you know, I'm pro concentration camps, and I told the Chinese president that, and not in like his weird, you know, veiled, very bizarre sort of inscrutable policy positions, but clearly made those statements and accurately represented his engagements with foreign leaders, then I think that would be a really powerful argument and sort of a counter argument. But the fact is that the president of the United States is secretly pursuing a different objective than the rest of the government, right? We talked about Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill made this sort of really compelling sort of in her testimony. She said, you know, I realized that that Gordon Sondland was right, because I was pursuing the official policy of the United States and he was working on the president's policy. The idea
domestic political errand.
Domestic political errand.
Which is a great name for a band.
It is. We should form that band. But the idea that those can be two separate things, like, that's not valid. That doesn't work at all. And the only way to repair that rift is for people who are in the room to tell the public what's happening, or in circumstances in which they aren't able to inform the public, to inform congressional overseers, which is why the refusal of people like Mike Pompeo or Bill Barr to even come and testify in the first place, let alone failure to be fully candid with Congress or to alert the public, is just really, really alarming. And it's why Congress should keep trying to get their stories under oath and on the record, and not just litigating in court questions of subpoenas, but using the other legislative tools they have available, appropriations, authorizations, nominations, to force those answers and information. Like, that's the whole idea here, guys. Like, this is not just like the United States. James Madison is like, fuck it, whoever was the president, just like do whatever the fuck you want, and the rest of us will deal with it. Like, that's not the system. It's this balance. And so the idea that people would try and offer this as a defense, I can't take that in good faith. And I think it does need to get like really swatted down strongly. Sorry, I guess I should have asked if I'm allowed to say expletives on in lieu of fun.
You are definitely allowed to say expletives and whatever else you hear today. Just remember what Susan just said, because right then she was channeling the word of God into your brain. While she was talking, I received the following comment from somebody who prefers to be identified only as an unnamed member of the deep state, who writes, 1, if parts of Jim Comey's memos were appropriately classified at the confidential level, and they were, then Bolton's descriptions are also appropriately classified at the confidential level, simply because of their true, albeit minor, damage to national security, i.e. that they name foreign leaders and in exactly the way that Comey's memos did. Same rationale for most of the bullshit identified in Hillary Rodham Clinton's emails, the Bradley, Chelsea Manning materials, etc. Number 2, let's talk about Bill Barr. Everyone already knows Trump is a mendacious, crayon-eating asshole. I'm quoting here. This is not my own view. According to the Washington Post, quote, Bolton says he was so alarmed by Trump's determination to do favors for autocrats such as Erdogan and Xi that he scheduled a meeting with Attorney General William P. Barr in 2019 to discuss the president's behavior. Bolton writes that Barr agreed he was also worried about the appearances created by Trump's behavior, unquote. What about the actual potential illegality of Trump's behavior? Sounds much like the rationale of not forwarding the U.S. intelligence community whistleblower complaint. How should Barr be held to account, particularly given DOJ Inspector General's statutory limitations to investigate the Justice Department? So there, Susan, 2 complicated questions on the table. What do you think?
So we're going to get the answer of whether or not there is any legitimately classified information. I haven't had time to carefully parse the book. The government has not yet said specifically what information they believe is classified. That said, I would say the evidence that the original reviewer cleared the book in its entirety as not containing any classified information and informed the White House of that, only for a political actor to intervene, that suggests that we are not talking about legitimately classified information here.
And just to be clear, just to clarify, foot stomp Susan's point, in the case of the Comey memos, the people who determined retroactively that there was some confidential, I think they classified a couple of words at the confidential level, were Comey's staff, right? So this was not a group of political people coming in and overruling, the career staff which had cleared it. This was, I believe, I'm not sure if this is public, but if it's not, it is now. The person who actually flagged, retroactively classified this stuff was Lisa Page. Jim Baker, and I'm not sure if Pete Strzok was involved in that or not, but these was not like the political echelon swooping in and overruling the career echelon. This was the career echelon doing its job. And I do think Susan's point is really valid, that is a different thing than what appears to have happened here.
I also think we should acknowledge one thing, and that's that John Bolton has totally broken the rules here, right? Whenever you get a security clearance and you sign this agreement, your agreement is to participate in the pre-publication review process from beginning to end. Your agreement is not to participate in the pre-publication review process unless you don't think the government's playing nice and you really, really want to get your book out, right? So John Bolton has breached this process. It would be really, really damaging if other people acted in the same way and just decided, well, they weren't going to participate in the pre-publication review process, or they were going to publish their books as soon as they saw fit. So taken on its face, there's very little about Bolton's conduct that's defensible. That said, I do think we need to acknowledge that the government has not chosen to enforce these provisions against very many other people. And there is every indication here that this is politically motivated and motivated to chill speech. And so on one hand, like I take it as maybe technically accurate. And by the way, John Bolton broke the rules, and the government can lawfully seize all of the proceeds of this book, even if none of the information it turns out to be classified. Your obligation is to undertake the process. And that's what John Bolton has breached. And so I can't defend it as like, John Bolton's a great guy and other people should follow suit. I just don't think we should over legalize it and blind ourselves to what is clearly actually happening here, which is the president doesn't want this story to come out. And I think now we all understand why.
All right. I think Matthew Chekhov gets the last question here, unless the Big Blue blogger reappears, in which case we'll hold on for one more question. But Big Blue has vanished. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Which question do you want, Ben? I asked two.
I only saw one, but I don't remember which it is. So I think you get to choose here.
Oh man, Ben. Okay.
You could pose them both and let Susan choose which to answer.
That's a very fun idea. Okay. So my first question was actually about some breaking news from the LA Times. It turns out that prosecutors are thinking about criminal charges for Bolton beyond just trying to stop publication of the book. So I was wondering, what you thought about that. The LA Times didn't specify what they were thinking of, but I assume it has something to do with disseminating classified information without authorization. And my second question was a rational security related question. And I've been a long-time listener of Rational Security, and at the end of every episode, you do the object lessons segment, but I don't think that you've explained exactly like the origins of it lately. So I was wondering if you could explain the origins of the object lesson segment. So you can answer both or one of them. Just was curious. Thanks so much.
So that is easy.
We'll let Susan address the first question, but the second question actually predates Susan's presence on Rational Security. So I think I have to answer that one. But Susan, answer the substantive question first, and then I'll close with the Rational Security question.
Yeah, so I haven't read this story, and I don't know what charges they would be talking about. The idea that this would be like an Espionage Act case, or even a negligent dissemination style case, on the facts that we know, that doesn't even really pass the laugh test. Whether he's right or wrong, and whoever has sort of the real prerogative to assert classified information, what is classified information, which ultimately lies with the president. John Bolton clearly does not believe that there's classified information in this manuscript, and he has undertaken a months-long process with the government in order to eliminate information that they've deemed to be classified information. Almost all of the statutes require either an intention to harm national security, or even statutes like what was frequently talked about, sort of Hillary Clinton's emails, even sort of negligent statutes in practice require other aggravating sort of factors to actually support prosecution. And so there's absolutely no way John Bolton is getting criminally prosecuted for this. Like, this is a pure contracts issue. And it's pretty disturbing if the government is threatening somebody with sort of specious criminal prosecution, whether at the specific direction of Donald Trump or Bill Barr, or just of their own accord, because that is like real abuse of prosecutorial discretion. And so unless there's a whole lot to this story that the public does not know, there's no chance that John Bolton would be facing criminal charges. And the idea that somebody in the U.S. Attorney's Office in LA or elsewhere would be suggesting that is something to be really pretty alarmed about.
So Matthew, the answer to your question about Rational Security is that when we originally started Rational Security before Susan came to Brookings and Lawfare. while she was still at NSA. I think she showed up probably about 6 months late after the show had started, and we quickly incorporated her into it. But it was originally just Shane and Tammy and me. And our original conception of the show was that we were each going to bring a text that we wanted to talk about, and we were each going to bring an object. And so there were going to be 6 segments where we would kind of go around and talk about the text, and then go around and talk about the objects. And the problem with this was that 6 segments is actually super long. And so it kind of evolved the 3 texts, which we called wordplay. We used to call them wordplay and object lessons. The 3 wordplays eventually evolved into the 3 segments that we now use now. And then the object lessons became less substantive and more kind of curios, but they remained as known as object lessons. And so the thing is, it evolved toward, I think, the form that was really pioneered in the podcast world by the Slate Political Gab Fest, which is 3 major segments and then 3 what they call cocktail chatter, which is a curio from each of the participants. But in our case, it really started out as something very different and kind of evolved toward that form. And whether that was the influence of the Slate Political Gab Fest, or whether it was actually just that is the natural form for, a kind of like gab festy podcast, I really don't know. And I've thought about it, and I really don't know the answer to it. But if you go back to the first few episodes, we were trying to do a 6 segment thing, a wordplay segment and a object lesson segment. And the one residue of that, or the 2 residues, are 3 substantive segments and then object lessons. So that is the answer to your rational security history question, which I don't even think Susan knew that answer. Because I think by the time Susan came to rational security, the object lessons were kind of little jokes that we had at the end. And that, speaking of the end, brings us to the end of our show. Susan Hennessey, it is ridiculous that it has taken 83 episodes for us to get you on the show. So ridiculous. Come back soon.
I will.
And Kate, who do we have for tomorrow?
Marty Lederman.
Oh, is tomorrow Marty Lederman or John Zittrain?
No, Jonathan Zittrain was going to be today, but we bumped him. We literally we bumped John Zittrain for Susan.
I could not be more honored, and we'll be emailing him immediately to share.
You basically have a degree at Harvard Law School now. Like, Susan.
I actually do have a degree there. So,
well, I mean, also you could teach there. That's
I'll teach his classes.
I met Susan when she was a mere student at Harvard Law School, and I just want to say the first time we met, as she persistently reminds me, I was wearing 5-toed shoes.
Yep.
That made a real impression on Susan.
Ben. See, this is you're no wonder you've vibed so well. And I really picked that word on purpose. Vibram.
Yeah, I see what you did there,
into
girl.
into the Zoom culture, because you can't see your shoes. So it's great.
Oh no, he proudly wore them. This is not a source of shame.
No. Oh no, yeah. I know. I mean, he proudly wore them, but now he has no reason to show them off. So there's just it's the pride or not. We're saving him from himself.
I am not wearing Vibram 5-fingered shoes right now, but I could be. Susan Hennessey will join us again soon. We will be back tomorrow at 5:00 with Marty Lederman, which means you will be blessed with intense intelligence, and no one else will be able to get a word in, which is fine. Kate, until then, what do we say?
We don't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, come and hang out with Susan Hennessey and the Lisa Page puppet.
There you go. See you tomorrow.
Bye, guys.